Since this and other webinars are funded by one of our National Institute of Mental Health implementation studies, we wanted to bring this webinar back to the area of global mental health and how it intersects right now with implementation research. So many of you may know about global mental health, since many of you are based or doing work in low and middle income countries. As a review, though, there is a large global mental health treatment gap. Mental health disorders account for approximately a third of years lived with disability, and depression is currently third on the global burden of disease. Despite this, 90% of those in need do not receive treatment. So there's a very large gap between need and those who receive treatment. This treatment gap is even more severe with children, with every 0.16% receiving treatment. The field of global mental health in low and middle income countries has now shown that various evidence-based practices are feasible, adaptable, and effective. And yet the uptake of these interventions by locally based organizations has been sluggish at best. What does this mean? This means that we have the solutions or treatments, but that they're not reaching the populations that need it. We'd like to talk about a few implementation strategies that have been evaluated to try to begin to address the mental health treatment gap in low and middle income countries. We will use two examples. First, the apprenticeship model of training and supervision, and second, the common elements treatment approach. To start with, the apprenticeship model of training and supervision. So as we start talking about the apprenticeship model of training and supervision, I wanted to remind everyone about the Dr. Proctor model of implementation science here, where you can look and see where some of these implementation strategies we'll be talking about fit into implementation research. All of these that we'll be talking about today have been guided by research outcomes and different experiences. To start, a barrier was identified. This barrier was the fact that in many low and middle income countries, there are no mental health professionals. A solution was a task-sharing approach, wherein lay individuals with little or no mental health training could be utilized to provide services and help reduce the treatment gap. The apprenticeship model or strategy of training and supervision is a detailed implementation process that can be used for task shifting and more likely to result in behavior change. So this is a strategy used and tested in low and middle income countries in the field of mental health. So here is a diagram walking you through the apprenticeship strategy in global mental health. There is an in-person training, usually 7 to 10 days, when the intervention is initially taught. This is conceptualized as the smallest part, as the theory in that you learn through doing. The in-person training is really the foundation from which to build. The next step is practice groups, done locally where a local supervisor meets with 3 to 5 local counselors and role plays or practices the treatment to enhance skills. These groups turn into supervision groups when counselors take a practice case, usually starting with one practice case at a time. Here, they learn through doing with detailed support from their supervisor. Finally, you see here counselors would gain a number of cases within the program or study, but with constant ongoing supervision. Note that local supervisors are speaking weekly to expert trainers who guide them through supervision skills and review all the counselors' cases, so there is supervisory capacity also. Within the apprenticeship model or strategy, there is a balance between fidelity, or sticking to an evidence-based practice, and flexibility, which is required in different contexts and settings. To achieve this, the apprenticeship strategy has regular feedback cycles built in, where expert trainers, supervisors, counselors, and clients are all working to balance fidelity and flexibility while at the same time building capacity. Here are some implementation research questions related to training and supervision strategies that we are investigating now. What is the differential effectiveness of different dosages of the apprenticeship approach? In other words, how much supervision do we have to give for how long? Also, what is effective train-the-trainer program when working in low and middle income countries with lay providers? How do we create trainers in these evidence-based practices when we're dealing with individuals with little to no mental health training? So we're going to talk about the second implementation strategy example in low and middle income countries, common elements treatment approach. Again, we began with identifying barriers in mental health provision in low and middle income countries. Here we found that the focus of many evidence-based practices on one disorder, for example, depression only or trauma only, was a potential barrier to reducing the treatment gap. The singular focus of most evidence-based treatments results in many problems. For example, training in multiple evidence-based practices, which you would need to train and scale up, is really unfeasible given the resources needed. So, for example, you would need to train up in a treatment for depression, and a treatment for trauma, and a treatment for substance use, and a treatment for parenting, etc., just to cover the most common mental health issues. This would take a long time and be very expensive. If you use singular-focused evidence-based practices, one would need a referral system where you could link individuals with counselors who are trained in their specific problem. So matching a client that has depression with a provider that's trained in a depression treatment. Mastering multiple evidence-based practices is actually very difficult, even for very highly trained mental health professionals. Number 4 here is the fact that comorbidity is very common. It is rare for a client to have only depression, and much more common for clients to show symptoms across many different disorders. Lay counselors may have trouble managing this within single, focused, evidence-based practices. Finally, this requires some degree of conceptualization based on the DSM categories, which is often not known to lay providers in low and middle income countries. So what exactly is the common elements treatment approach? It is a transdiagnostic approach, or one that aims to address a range of common mental health problems. It is built from elements that make up existing evidence-based treatments for single disorders. CETA is not a new treatment, but actually an approach that utilizes the elements that we already know is effective and puts decisions about element, the order of elements, and how many sessions in the hands of lay providers. There is more we could describe with CETA, but we want to keep the focus of this webinar on the idea that this is an implementation strategy to help reduce the treatment gap. So these next 2 slides are going to show you the CETA elements. There are only 9 elements, so not as many choices as other transdiagnostic models that might be used by mental health professionals. So you see here we have engagement, a simplified name being encouraging participation. Psychoeducation, a very common element in most evidence-based practices. Relaxation, and then behavioral activation, which has been renamed as getting active just for simplicity. The other CETA elements here, you see cognitive coping or cognitive restructuring, again, a very common element in most evidence-based practices. The simplified name is thinking in a different way, part 1 and 2. You see exposure here, suicide and safety, and also substance use. Another strategy we used in CETA is to develop step sheets. Here is an example of a step sheet. This includes very concrete steps that would go into the delivery of every one of those elements. Now, this may seem strange to someone who's a trained professional in mental health, but to a lay provider, we have found that the implementation of these elements is greatly helped by step sheets. As you see here, we lay out, even in quotations, exactly what they might say to a client. So, for example, with cognitive coping, they would start with the what and say to their client, "Today, we will talk about how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are connected. We will focus on how we can think in different ways about a situation, and it will change feelings and behaviors or actions." So it gives them a way to communicate. So today we have walked through the definition of implementation science, some conceptual models, implementation science outcomes, and talked about how implementation science relates to global mental health using 2 examples. We hope that this webinar has been helpful in learning more about this area of research and hopefully has prompted some interest from you. There is much work to be done in low and middle income countries to help reduce the treatment gap and that movement of science to practice. We want to acknowledge the many people and organizations that have supported this research and work over the years. There are many local partners and respondents in all the areas we work, many funders, and all of our team partners. For those of you who have questions, we have a global mental health website that you can go to and can find out more information about dissemination and implementation science. Here also are emails for faculty members that have been involved in implementation science in low and middle income countries. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today.